Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So I want to start by saying welcome. I'm so glad to have you all here with us today. My name is Elizabeth McMentatenko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Muey Saeteurn, who is going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. For today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Saeteurn here with us. Dr. Saeteurn is an Associate Professor of History in the History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Department at UC Merced. Her work focuses on African history, in particular the social history of 20th century Kenya, development, agriculture, and rural history, and decolonization and independence studies. Dr. Saeteurn holds both a PhD and a master's in history from Washington University in St. Louis, and a BA in history from San Jose State. Her book, Cultivating Their Own, Agriculture in Western Kenya During the Development Era, came out in 2020. We're so happy to have her here with us today, and I'm going to turn this over now to Muey.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to share the screen. So lovely to see family and friends and former students and all that stuff. So I'm excited about this talk. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining me here or us here this afternoon. I'm thrilled that you have decided to spend your time, whether it be your lunchtime, or I know that a friend of mine is joining us from London. Hey, Mary, this evening. So to talk about my book, which I have described as my firstborn child, Cultivating Their Own, Agriculture in Western Kenya During the Development Era. And as mentioned, I am a history faculty member here at the University of California, Merced, and I am a social historian, focusing on, like Elizabeth has mentioned, the decolonization and nation building era during the 1950s and 60s, specifically in Kenya. And just to kind of situate ourselves here, I wanted to put a map here just because we want to make sure everyone's on the same page. We're specifically talking about East Africa, right? We're talking about Kenya, and in particular, we're going to be talking about Western Kenya today. So in this region where the cursor here is. And so as a social historian, a thread that runs through all of my research concerns the ways in which rural African men and women shaped large-scale historical processes while positioning themselves as global actors in the making of the modern globalized world. And so now that we kind of are situated and have an indication of where I'm at, I want us to begin the talk today. To begin, we need to go back to the year 1962. Essentially to the period when the people and its institutions were in transition from being colonial subjects and possessions to Kenyan citizens and establishments. So we are at the eve of Kenya's decolonization from Britain. At the start of this year, in 1962, a coalition government made of politicians from Kenya's two national parties of KANU, which is the Kenya African National Union, and KADU, which is the Kenya African Democratic Union, had been created to take the country through to its final stages of independence. So here's just a picture of, a couple of photos I found in the archives of the independence negotiations talks that were happening both in London and in Nairobi. And here's just a photo of the then Prime Minister who would become the President of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, celebrating on December 13th, 1963. But Kenya officially gains its independence from the UK on December 12th, 1963. So since Kenya was a British settler colony, you have this coalition interim government that comes to power in 1962, consisted of both African nationalist leaders and politically moderate European settlers. And as it begins its task to help Kenya achieve complete uhuru or independence, this interim coalition government initiated and continued development projects and programs in the hopes of addressing the major issues, concerns, and expectations of local people and of the Kenyan state. So just giving us an idea of some of the concerns and issues of this moment included, one, this huge grievances on behalf of millions of land poor or landless Kenyans, many of whom had participated in what was then known as the Mau Mau Uprising, which essentially was a civil war between the land-rich Kenyans and poor landless Kenyans that took place primarily in the central region of Kenya from 1952 to 1960. And so millions of Kenyans in 1962 were still living in the countryside at the eve of this process of the decolonization, and many were living in locations that were overcrowded and where the soil fertility had declined due to overuse or overcultivation. And here's just a photo of a famous picture of some of the, quote, Mau Mau rebels that had been arrested as a result of, the campaigns or the military campaigns in the early 1950s. Another issue was this threat of an exodus by many in the European settler farming community who had owned plantations and ranches that produced 80% of the exports and that employed nearly half the workers in Kenya. So the Europeans were worried about what would essentially happen to them in a Kenya that was going to be now run by Africans or Kenyans in particular. So a number of the settlers, the British settlers who were effectively British citizens, were expecting and in fact demanding that the British government do something to help them to relocate back to the metropole or somewhere else in the United Kingdom or elsewhere once the process was done. In addition to this exodus of the European settler farming community, you also had at this time a sharp decline in Kenya's economy as the foreign business investors, the multinationals, either walked away from their investments or just outright refused to do anything until they had a better sense of which type of government would come into place as the leaders who came into power, what type of government they would create. Now, keep in mind, we're in the context of the Cold War era, so the investors really didn't have any sense of whether or not the Kenyan government that was coming into place, who had been, nice with the Soviet Union, whether or not they were going to come and essentially nationalize these businesses or continue along the same lines as they had been with the open markets and practicing capitalism. And finally, you also had a coalition government facing a huge unemployment crisis at this eve of independence. A 1960 government survey of unemployment, for example, estimated that only 435,000 of the 1.5 million Kenyan males between the ages of 16 and 45 years old had wage employment outside of the rural sector. And so reports show that between 1960 and 1963, about the time that we're roughly talking about here, Kenya had lost 80,000 formal sector jobs that resulted from the decolonization process. And so this is the political, social, and economic landscape of Kenya as it's entering into its final stages of decolonization. And this is the context in which I want to introduce you to two following individuals who will be with us throughout the course of this talk and who are characters in the book, right? Historical figures and characters. I want to introduce you to Garrison and Nathan. Both men resided in Western Kenya. So Garrison here lives in the Chevakali sublocation of Maragoli land. And Nathan, to the right here, lives about 50 miles north of Garrison in the Chekalini sublocation of what is present-day Lugari district. So in 1962, as Kenya entered its final stages of decolonization from Britain, both Nathan and Garrison lived in what was and is known today as Maragoli land, this region down here. So this rural area was and remains a heavily populated region. Just to give you a sense, an idea of the region's alarmingly high population density during the period that we're examining, a 1951 census report for the North and South Maragoli locations revealed that there were 606,798 people living within the 95 square mile region that constituted this area. And by 1960, the area had a population density of 1,230 people per square mile. So this gives you an idea that the people living in this region are very much land poor, right? So the largest pieces of land that homesteads or families have access to is no more than 2 acres per household or per homestead. So going back to Nathan and Garrison, at the time in 1962, both were unemployed. They were land poor, meaning they had no real claim to sufficient land, at least nothing substantial in their home locations, and each had some sort of formal educational training. It was during the same year that the local administrative officials in their respective locations encouraged both Garrison and Nathan to take part in an ambitious rural development program known as the Million Acres Program. More specifically, both were asked to participate in a Million Acre Program project known as the Lugari Settlement Scheme, or Lugari Land Settlement Scheme. This particular settlement scheme offered its participants access to at least 10 acres of land, some dairy cattle, and technical training at the Farmers Training Institute that was located at the settlement site if they were willing to relocate from their homes to become full-time farmers at the new settlement location. For all intents and purposes, the architects of the Million Acre Program had people like Garrison, who was 24 years old at the time, and Nathan, who was 28 years old at the time, in mind as these ideal candidates because they were able-bodied, rural young men who seemed to need a little encouragement or motivation to become what historian Sarah Berry has termed the rural economic men. In theory, these rural economic men were industrious, right? They were forward-looking, able-bodied individuals whom development experts and rural specialists assumed would eagerly and rapidly evolve into modern smallholder commercial farmers if they were provided access to proper resources and training. The Kenyan government had hoped that these economic men, or the progressive farmers that they would eventually evolve into, would help Kenya grow its agricultural-based economy into the post-colonial period. Yet only one of the men took up the calling to become an economic man, and that was Nathan, who received 15 acres when he joined the scheme. So in explaining his reason or his rationale to not join the scheme, Garrison told me in 2011 when I interviewed him the following, quote, "Well, it was just because we didn't want to leave our home. Home is home. We didn't want to go to new places where we would go and start a new life because we had already settled this way. And we thought, now going to a new place, where would we get water? Where would we get the money to build a house? Where would we get this and that?" End quote. So I completely empathize with Garrison, as the fear of the unknown and familiar attachments are strong and justifiable reasons in themselves. But as I continued my conversations with him, speaking to him about what his expectations were for Kenya's independence, it became abundantly clear to me that even if he had a larger piece of land at home, that Garrison's ambitions were elsewhere, that he was wanting to work off the land. In other words, Garrison never imagined himself to stay on the land. Rather, he felt that his calling in life was actually to become a teacher. You see, in fact, by the time that the local administrative officials were advertising the Lugari settlement scheme in the 1960s, he was already training to become a teacher. So even though he was given this opportunity to, quote, develop himself, he never applied for a position in the scheme. He simply had no intentions of becoming a state-sponsored farmer within an independent Kenya because he saw a more promising future in teaching. He understood that his career choice would not only provide him a higher and more stable income, but also that it would elevate him into an esteemed position within his family and amongst the local community. This was evident when he told me, quote, "See, when you've taken teaching, they'll know that you've at least taken something," end quote. Now, in contrast, when I spoke to Nathan about his decision to relocate, he expressed that even though he was terrified of leaving his family and was just okay with the idea of becoming a full-time farmer, it was the access to the larger piece of land that drove him to essentially take up and relocate. So he told me the following, quote, "I look back at my family and there were 5 of us, 5 sons. So looking at the piece of land that at home, I realized that it was kind of small. I realized that if I go to the settlement scheme and I get the 15 acres, that means that I'll be there alone, but I at least have 15 acres to myself. So I told myself that I should just go," end quote. I bring your attention to these men and share their decisions about the Million Acre Program because not only does Garrison's choice challenge the development experts' erroneous assumptions that any rural person would want to become a full-time farmer if they were given land and the proper training, but more importantly, both men's decisions capture the nuances of rural communities, highlighting the point that not all rural people share the same expectations and ideas about Kenya's development and nation-building projects, especially during this euphoric moment in their country's history. Rather, each man's reason or rationale for either declining or accepting to join the Lugari settlement scheme was based on their individual circumstances and the particular expectations that they had for themselves and their families during Kenya's decolonization and independence period. This nuance is oftentimes missing when development experts, specialists, and practitioners speak about the underdeveloped peoples of the global South. The variance between the groups and diversities that exist within rural communities usually is rendered invisible by the one-size-fits-all models and strategies often proposed to solve Africa's problems. Moreover, the scholarship about the shortcomings of Africa's development era and the critiques on its failed nationalist projects like the Million Acre Program rarely account for the fact that at the development table sat a very different actors who at the dawn of independence had a very different motivation for being at that table and a very different understanding of the possibilities of that moment, of the room there was to maneuver in, and of what the possibilities were for real change. This is the aim of my book, Cultivating Their Own. Based on 2 years of extensive field and archival research conducted throughout Kenya, the United Kingdom, and the United States, Cultivating Their Own examines efforts to promote agricultural development in a densely populated rural area of Western Kenya known as Maragoli land during the country's transition to independence in the late 1950s and its first few years under a de facto one-party rule during the 1960s. Specifically, the book examines two complex questions that continue to drive the research agendas of international aid agencies and development scholars in the 21st century. The first question of which is, well, why, after more than 50 years of development, have interventions in aid failed to yield poverty alleviation in sub-Saharan Africa? And second, why did the agricultural development projects that were unfolding in places like rural Western Kenya during this period of the late colonial and early national period not take off as envisioned by modernization theorists? So as a social historian, I examine these intellectual questions by paying attention to the lived experiences of common people. In so doing, Cultivating Their Own moves the discussions of development and nation building away from urban centers and out of the hands of politicians, bringing it to the ground level. It is an alternative and more inclusive model, I argue, for studying the history of development and its relationship to the post-colonial African nation state. Centered around 4 development projects, namely the 4K program, the Chevokali Secondary School, the Friends Rural Service Program, and the Lugari Settlement Scheme, which aim to promote rural prosperity through the improvement of smallholder agriculture in Maragoli land, the book argues that the projects failed to achieve their objectives of poverty alleviation and to increase agricultural production because the national and international agents who designed and managed them ignored the aspirations of local people, as well as the structural constraints at the local level, chief amongst them the shortage of land in the region. Cultivating Their Own, then, more importantly, shows how ordinary Kenyans were neither ignorant nor simply victims of failed states or wrong-headed international interventions, but rather they were thoughtful actors who were who were in many ways active in shaping agricultural development policies and thus the nation-building process. So why Kenya, and specifically why Maragoli land? So Kenya is an interesting site to explore the assumptions and consequences of the first decade of the development era because its history has not been one of war, military rule, mass murder, or state collapse. It did not exhibit any of what development economist Paul Collier terms as the poverty traps. Neither has Kenya's history been one of improving living standards, industrialization, nor has it become a key player in the world's economy. In fact, the Kenyan nation state that emerged in 1963 not only inherited the political and economic institutions of the colonial era, but the nationalist leaders were, for the most part, aligned with Western powers and capitalist in orientation, meaning they upheld the liberal policies of the West and practiced democratic elections that contemporary development specialists and scholars are championing as the solutions to Africa's underdevelopment and deep poverty issues. And yet, Kenya's nation building and development projects did not take off as expected. This is exemplified in the history of rural development in Western Kenya, specifically within the Maragoli land location. And so next, the most obvious question is, why Maragoli land, right? So to be frank, I really didn't want to write another history of Mau Mau and of this war, this civil war that's taken place during this moment that I'm interested in, which is essentially the bulk of Kenya's historiography or the literature around this period. Rather, I am more interested or was more interested in exploring how the rural communities outside of central Kenya came to terms with the decolonization and independence processes and the moment. So even though they were far removed from the political hotbeds of Nairobi and Mombasa, I argue throughout the book that the people of Maragoli land were very much engaged with the nation building process and impacted and in many ways inconvenienced by the agricultural development strategies and programs of this period, especially because of their agricultural or farming background and their proximities to the Quaker Friends African Mission Station. So I'll be happy to talk more about the other case studies during the Q&A session, but I want to focus the remainder of our talk on the Million Acre program, which we've been introduced to so far, specifically talking about the Lugari settlement scheme, which I think is a good case study that drives home some of the major themes of the book. So bear with me as we move forward to the Million Acre program scheme, right? So the Million Acre program was a land transfer initiative that the coalition government, right, the 1962 coalition government and its British government advisors primarily implemented between 1962 and 1967. So it moves into the post-colonial period, this program. At the basis of this program was land transfer through purchase. So the land that is being used for this program scheme came from what was then known as the White Highlands. It's an area, this White Highlands is an area in the central part of the central and western part of the Rift Valley in Kenya, where the majority of European British settlers settled in throughout the 19th and or late 19th, early 20th century when Kenya was becoming a colony. And so by 1962, those settler farmers who had the large estates were given the opportunity to sell back their land to the Kenyan government. Now, the land that they were selling back, keep in mind the prices were fixed at 1955 prices and not 1962. So they got more money than they would have had the prices been accounted for in 1962. So this land that was being sold back by the European settlers who were exiting the state was then to be used by the Kenyan government for the settlement schemes. And the main point of the Million Acre program was then to encourage political stability, to promote economic growth, and to create a pro-Kenyan Western state. More practically, it was to address the landless and land hunger problems without decreasing agricultural production. So we're not talking about the multinational corporation estates here. They're not breaking up the ranches and these huge estates. They're primarily breaking up some smaller estates, or yes, maybe one or two, and we'll get into that conversation about how large the lands can be. But for the most part, they are wanting, meaning the Kenyan government at this time, are wanting to maintain the production level that that has always been and has taken Kenya into the colonial period and into the post-colony. So this land settlement scheme under the Million Acre program was designed primarily for poor Kenyans who had no land and were unemployed. So the people that we've met are the two men that we've met throughout this talk. Altogether, there were close to 125 separate regional settlement schemes under the Million Acre Program by 1967, with close to 35,000 Kenyan families participating in the settlement schemes. This program was largely financed by the British. The estimated cost for the program was 25.5 million pounds, of which the British funded 21 million pounds. 1/3 of the cost was a loan, which essentially meant that the Kenyan government was responsible for repaying the remaining balance. The costs were naturally offloaded to the Kenyan settlers. So this meant that the land in the schemes were not given up back freely to the African settlers. In addition to the land not being free, those who participated in the Million Acre schemes, like Lugari, had limited security on their land. Instead of being issued a freehold title at the very beginning, the settlers who took up these schemes were given promise of freehold tenure provided certain conditions were met. So land that they were given, the settlers, was to be used for agricultural purposes only. They could not be subdivided. So if a family brought in 5 sons, for example, they couldn't then subdivide it and give it to their sons. It couldn't be transferred, nor could it be leased without the prior written consent from the settlement officers who administered these schemes. Each settler had to then develop a portion of his land. So they had to, for example, cultivate 1 acre, build a house, as well as fence or enclose their property within a 6 months period of entrance into the program. Failure to comply with any of these conditions resulted in the settlers' eviction. So scholars who have written about the Million Acre Program have pointed to these factors. The fact that the settlers had to buy the land in the first place and the conditions of tenure as a leading cause behind Kenya's rural underdevelopment in the post-colonial period. Historians and political scientists writing in the 1970s in particular argued that such conditions made the Million Acre Program unrealistic and not at all concerned with addressing Kenya's major land problems. And so they argue this development program could not have realistically developed the entire rural sector. But I agree. But I also make this point that while the financial conditions were problematic and may have accommodated the European settlers more than it did to address the needs of the average Kenyans, I argue and maintain that the expenses did not keep people motivated, keep those who were motivated and those resourceful Kenyans from taking advantage of the scheme once they themselves deemed that it's what they had wanted to do. People like Nathan, for example, sold off their possessions and asked family members in urban centers to contribute to the costs associated with participating in the Million Acre Program. In other words, the expenses were not the only concerns and factors that weighed heavily on the minds of rural Kenyans at this time. This was especially the case for a number of Maragoli land residents when they were contemplating on whether or not they should participate in one of the Million Acre Program's projects known as the Lugari settlement scheme in the early 1960s. For many, it was simply not a matter of whether or not they could afford the expenses to relocate to Lugari, but whether or not the Lugari settlement scheme actually offered the lifestyles and benefits that they had wanted and desired at that moment. The Lugari settlement scheme was one of the first schemes to get started in 1962. And it was initially open to the residents living in the Maragoli area because of the population density. The site for the scheme was about 50 miles from the Maragoli location. So Lugari actually had been a sisal estate. It was a 19,000 acre sisal estate. So yes, this was one of the huge sisal estates. And so sisal, just to get everybody on the same page, is it's an agricultural product that you can use to make fiber and rope with, and it was a huge export crop during this period. And you essentially would cultivate it in, the Kenyan government would export this at huge amounts during this period. And the Kenyan government had purchased, or the coalition government had purchased this sisal estate in April of 1962. And by May of that same year, you had officials on the ground in Maragoli land talking to residents about relocating up to this estate. So the government had two major concerns that it wanted to address as part of this purchase. First, it wanted to ease the land pressure problems in Western Kenya. This program was supposed to relocate close to 3,000 family members from the Maragoli region. And that's about 24,000 people from this particular location within a span of 5 years. And second, this Lugari settlement scheme project was supposed to provide the African or Kenyan settlers with the resources to participate in the modern cash economy. Since the settlers and the settlement plots were carved out of the former sisal estates, the residents were supposed to continue to cultivate the sisal plots along with the food crops to acquire monetary income. In fact, the experts or the specialists who had come in to create this program had estimated that the average 10-acre holder at Lugari was to make about 25 pounds, which was equivalent to 500 shillings annually, if they could essentially cultivate their holdings according to the recommended guidelines set forth by the Ministry of Settlement and the agricultural officers. For example, in 1962, these Lugari settlers were supposed to do the following. They were supposed to plant on their assigned plots 1/2 acre of fruit trees, 2 acres of subsistence food crops, 2 acres of cash crops. And so in this case, they would continue to cultivate sisal, and then devote 5.5 acres of their land to grass for their cattle. But as Garrison's story suggests, right, and this is just a map of where the residents, they were talking about residents in this area relocating up to Lugari. And as Garrison's story suggests, the government's objectives were in many ways disconnected from the on-the-ground realities and expectations of the very group of people it was aiming to develop. So even though land was hard to come by and it was socially important resources for young Kenyan males like Garrison, because land allowed one to access to adulthood, right, within the community. So using through land, one can oftentimes get married, raise a family, and provide for their future sons. A number of the residents in Maragoli land actually declined to take part in the Lugari settlement scheme and thus to participate at all with the Million Acre program. So as a social historian, my objective was to gain insights from potential program participants as to why they declined to participate in the schemes. But through my research, I learned many points of views. There were a few key reoccurring themes motivating the decision-making process for those who chose not to participate, which I want to turn to. First of which was the point that farming was not an attractive career choice. To be a settler meant that one was committed to farming full time. The requirement that the Lugari settlers must not have any economic interests outside of agriculture was very discouraging for people who already had aspirations to become something other than a farmer. So in particular, it kept a number of educated and ambitious Maragoli residents from joining the scheme, even though they saw land as a social and economic asset that would provide them essentially Social Security in the long run. Again, if we consider Garrison here, who was already in his teacher's training program, by the time that the officials were talking to them about the scheme, he wouldn't have been able to, or been able to qualify for the scheme, as well as continue to become a teacher if he participated in the program. Moreover, in talking to the residents of Maragoli land, it became clear that several of my informants considered farming a dirty job. Pearson Zaveni, for example, noted that his father, who was a peasant farmer at the time, did not allow him to think about agriculture as an occupation. So when Pearson's father was offered the chance to relocate his family to the scheme, he declined to do so because the location was undeveloped and far from schools and what he essentially expected his children to do and to go to. So Pearson's family comes from Maragoli land, and I had mentioned earlier that this region is home to the Friends Quaker Africa mission station. So the Quakers at this time have already established very sophisticated educational institutions in this region of Maragoli land. So Pearson's father was in many ways expecting to send his children to these schools and to take advantage of the missionary schooling that was being offered. So Pearson's father then did not want his children to think that life in an independent Kenya had to be restricted to hard manual labor. Education, rather than a larger piece of land, was for the most part, the most valuable resource that Pearson's father believed that he could ensure his children would have access to or would own at independence. Along with thinking about whether or not they wanted to devote their lives to being full-time farmers, the Maragoli residents were also concerned with the Lugari settlement scheme's site and its location. Given that it was a sisal estate, potential settlers were skeptical that other crops could be successfully grown on it, which meant to them that there'd be more expenses in the long run. This was one of the main reasons why Jerome Kagia right here refused to submit an application to join the scheme. Even though his father had demanded, unlike Pearson's father, Jerome's father here demanded that he take an interest in the Lugari settlement project because Jerome had come from a household of 17 children, you see. And so this essentially meant that Jerome would not have any access to any sizable piece of land on his father's homestead whatsoever. And so Jerome, however, was not interested, especially because he was able to visit the settlement location. He explained during my visit with him that when he visited the location, he had realized that he would actually have to spend more money if the settlement authorities requested that the settlers plant other crops than sisal, which is effectively what happened in the 1960s and 70s because the market for sisal crashed. And so a lot of the settlers had to kind of transition and turn to and look at other crops. And so Jerome told me the following, quote, I looked at the type of soil, the size of the land, and I realized that if you have to uproot sisal and start planting something like maize, then you'd have to use a lot of inputs to get what you want, end quote. So as a result, Jerome declined to participate. In addition to problematic soil conditions, most Maragoli residents were also worried about the fact that the Lugari settlement site was in a location that did not have established markets, schools, hospitals, and that it was far away from the comforts of home. Although the Kenyan government and settlement officers had plans to develop townships, which would include market centers and health and educational facilities, in 1962, as the schemes were taking off, the settlement sites were undeveloped, making Maragoli residents such as Jonas here not at all enthusiastic about participating. When I asked if she and her husband had the opportunity to join the scheme, Jonas told me the following quote, I was among those who refused to go. I feared that I was going to a strange land. I did not know what I was going to encounter there. So I decided to remain at a place that I knew best, end quote. And finally, the financial expenses tied to the Lugari scheme also caused the Maragoli residents to question their government's motives and made the people very much skeptics of this program. Recall that the schemes were not free to participants, right? There were fees that they were responsible for. The fees included a registration fee. In 1962, they cost between 80 to 114 shillings. It was calculated according to the size of the assigned plot that the participants had access to or were granted. And so this fee, this registration fee, was actually due in full once the applicants received notice that they were admitted into the scheme. In addition to the registration fee, they also had a settlement loan or a fixed mortgage. In 1962, this fixed mortgage was about 1,600 shillings per household, payable over 30 years at a 6% interest rate. And by the next year, it had increased to 2,400 shillings. So to help you put these fees and costs into perspectives, I found that the farm laborers who were the targeted audience for this scheme were being paid about 2 shillings per day if they were able to find work during this time. So this is a huge financial. So this financial expense essentially made several people suspect that Kenya's independence did not mean much in terms of real change. For instance, certain individuals in Maragoli land were doubtful that the Kenyan government would allow the Lugari participants to keep their land, even if they managed to pay off the fees and loans affiliated with their relocation. People like Rachel, for example, speculated that the Lugari settlement was a trick by the government to remove people from their ancestral land and to get free manual labor. Being rendered a squatter was a real concern for many ordinary people in the Maragoli community. It was most poignant amongst the elders in the community who had grown up with stories of the Wazungu or the foreigners evicting Africans from their land. The possibility that the British colonialists would remain and that the Europeans might return for their land was a real concern for many, as Rachel explained to me. Rachel, who was 38 years old when she first learned of the land resettlement project in 1962, recalled that what kept some of her neighbors from joining the scheme, herself included, was that they didn't trust the government's intentions. More specifically, they didn't believe that the government or the national government would voluntarily give away land. And she tells me the following quote, "There was this rumor that spread all over that if you go there to Lugari, you'd end up being evicted. You're a squatter. You'd be kicked out. Either the government would kick you out or the white man would come and overturn their government and also take the pieces of land back," end quote. So her fears, actually, Rachel's fears were not unfounded. You see, the settlement schemes were carved out of these huge estates that already had laborers working on them, right? And these laborers were supposed to have been given priority in terms of access to land, but because Lugari and this sisal estate was meant for a specific purpose, and that was to ease land pressure problems in another region, in this case, in Maragoli land, the majority of the laborers were evicted, many of whom simply just squatted on the land and clashed with the incoming settler farmers. And so these stories were being heard by people like Rachel and her neighbors at the time. So Rachel and her neighbors therefore felt that it was better to have secure access to a smaller piece of land, like the 2 acres that they would have had access to at home, rather than to lose everything by joining the scheme. Because if they would have left, they would have also given up their ancestral land at home as well. Thus, by 1964, instead of having too many applicants from this location, the officials were actually having a difficult time persuading the local Maragoli community to even take up residence in Lugari. By this time, there were only 50 families from Maragoli who had participated and were willing to go up to Lugari. As a result, the local officials responsible for selecting Lugari settlers ultimately found themselves having to expand their search to include other parts of Western Kenya, suggesting that the government had given up its goal of ensuring that easing the land pressure problem in Maragoli land. Local officials in Maragoli consequently regarded this project as a failure. But was it really, right? And if for who to really think about it, if we consider Nathan, he would not consider this scheme a failure. In fact, he would tell you that it was one of the scariest and best decisions of his life. But that's not the point that I wanted to end with, right? I want to conclude with some of the takeaways from the book, I think. And this kind of first takeaway is this idea that the project of agrarianism, meaning this planned transformation of rural people into either productive commercial smallholder farmers or skilled manual laborers, which was and in many ways continues to be the de facto solution to Africa's problems, was nonsensical and disconnected from the on-the-ground realities and expectations of most rural Kenyans. Assuming the role of the progressive smallholder commercial farmer who was responsible for generating revenue for his country hardly appealed to many of the educated and able-bodied rural Kenyans who recognized the endless possibilities of living in a free Kenya. This attitude was especially true for individuals who grew up in this densely populated Maragoli locations of Western Kenya, where land, especially arable land, was very limited. For many, tilling the soil is more of an additional security and a necessary occupation that either they or their parents had to endure. It was something that they never expected to continue, at least not as a permanent occupation. Thus, despite access to these sufficient incentives, rural Kenyans participated in development projects when they were of practical benefit to their own household economies, often in contrast to the expectations of their neighbors, as well as outside experts and nationalists in Nairobi who depended on their labor for nation building to work. Developing agriculture on the ground never got off the ground, I argue, because of the absent alignment of local interests with or within the agendas of nation builders and foreign developers. So, and finally, please do this final point about the fact that the agrarian revolution that was supposed to have taken place in this region hardly germinated in places like Western Kenya, not because of failed states or ineffective markets or short-sighted policymakers. The reason instead laid largely in the fact that the agrarian development initiatives of this period were parts of a complex and crowded process at national, international, and local levels, whereby participants of the rural development programs each had their own notions of what constituted a developed life in Uhuru, and thus what it meant to be a Kenyan, that conflicted with the elite ruling class and outsiders' agendas for the rural citizenry in the post-colony. Hence, any discussions of the shortcomings of Africa's development era and the critiques of the failed nationalist projects must also consider the competing interests, the conflicting agendas, and the divergent conceptions of development and nationalism at the ground level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I know I'm seeing some comments. One of them is saying to please consider a workshop or conference in Western Kenya in the near future. So that may be a connection. And I also wanted to just kind of open it up for people to ask questions too. So you can feel free to unmute yourself, or if you want to just enter it into the chat, I can read questions out loud too. And while we're waiting, I actually had a question too. So I know you mentioned some of the other case studies that that you hadn't gone into a ton of detail about, but I was wondering if you could just talk briefly about those too.
Yeah, sure. So the other case studies, or the other chapters, one focuses on the rural service program that was started off by the Friends Quaker missionaries. So the Quakers actually are one of the largest populations of Quakers is housed lives in Western Kenya because of this population density. And so the missionary agriculturalists came in 1955 to start a program there to essentially kind of continue this notion that to develop this region needed to be along the lines of agricultural development. So the Rural Service Project essentially went to the different meetings or houses to encourage the members to, say, plant an acre for the large. So a lot of that, the proceeds from this Lord's Acres project would then go back to the church. So it was a way for them to cultivate good and stewardships, good stewards for the land, as well as making them good citizens, rural citizens for the nation state. So that was one. There was also the Chevakali Secondary School, which is again another school in this region that was once again pushing this agrarian narrative onto the local people, particularly the younger folks. And then the 4K Club is equivalent to what is known as the 4-H program here. Again, this motivation or this notion that it's to improve the economy and to uplift those in the rural sector, you need to motivate them to stay on the land. And how do you do that? By essentially getting to them when they are young and motivating them in that level.
Thank you. And I'm seeing another question. This one says, could you share your methods or approach to gathering the stories participants highlighted? Or in other words, how did you advertise for participation in the work?
Thank you, Yvonne. That's a great question. Well, you know, as a social historian, my methods are oral histories, right? Ethnographies for the most part. And I think we've had these conversations, Yvonne, in terms of how hard it is to be an outsider and then to kind of get into these communities. And obviously, I'm not Kenyan, nor do I speak the local dialect. I have some background in Swahili, but not by any means. I can simply say hello and all that stuff. And because it's a British colony, right, they expect and speak better English than I did, and I do certainly. And so a lot of the informants and participants of this program actually came, it was like a snowball effect. You know, I had one research assistant and who came from the community. And I want to problematize that actually because he was male. I think I would have, it turned out that I interviewed about over 80 and I had 80 like extensive interviews, but it was heavily leaning towards males. And so I think it had a lot to do with his gender and his positionality within the community. But a lot of the informants, I simply got access through him and his connections, because he was part of the rural service program that is continuing on till today. So that, or the agricultural extension program, excuse me. And then I just simply, because this region was so, such a Quaker, heavily dominated region, I went to their meetings and their church events on Sundays, and I just sat at the corner and simply like made a presentation at the end of the service to say who I was and if they were interested. But that's how these informants came to be, in terms of getting them to talk to me. But certainly it was in English and or in different dialects. Lugari is the language, the local dialect, which I certainly don't understand, and I don't think my research assistant understood too well. So if I can do it over again, I definitely would get someone local who understood.
Thank you. I'm seeing another question that says, were there any remaining threads or stories in your research that you'd like to expand upon, perhaps in future research and writing?
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. It's good to see you on here. I think, well, it's funny because, I started off by saying that this is like my firstborn child, right? I do have another real child, but this has been with me since my second semester of graduate school. And so it's been such, and I'm sure the graduate students on here can attest to this, just how long these projects are and how whether or not they could ever get done. And so once it was done, I didn't want to think about it anymore. And so to your question, Tiffany, I haven't really, I certainly, and this is again talking to the graduate students here, I got a lot more sources and interviews that I can definitely mine and maybe do an entirely different project. But there was something, I'm already knee deep in my second project in the tea industry in Kenya that I don't think if I could ever, if anything that really interests me is maybe the relationship between the Quakers in this region, to kind of, again, tease out that relationship a little bit more. But then that gets me into the realm of missionaries and that world. And I'm not too interested in that, exploring that at the moment. But thank you for your question, Tiffany. That always,
So we can wait for a second and see if there are more questions. I was wondering too, how you became interested in this region and this topic, because it's so interesting. I'm really glad to have gotten a chance to hear more about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I've always been interested in the 1950s and 60s, as a history student and major. Especially this moment of possibility, this moment of change, and what that does to communities and to the society. So I knew I wanted to really focus on the 1950s and 60s. And agriculture development is so big, right? You go to these spaces and you always, and the questions of, well, why is Africa always so poor? X, Y, and Z. Why are these people, why can't they farm? Why isn't there a green revolution that's happening in places like Kenya? So these questions have always motivated me, but I think personally, I grew up in I worked with my mom in an agricultural field. So I kind of, the stories of laborers and farmers and being in the countryside just resonates with me. And then I got lucky, right? I went to graduate school and I had a profoundly wonderful advisor who really nurtured and kind of pushed me to kind of think through these questions. And then I went to the Quaker archives because I went to graduate school in the Midwest, and the Quaker archives were the US Quakers, that is, because that's that is the sect that actually it has the missionary station there. It's the American Quakers, not the British Quakers. So their repository, their archives are actually located in Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. So I just was near there. And then I went there one day and literally I got lucky and I saw a microfilm that said agricultural development. So it started off there and I found the missionary agriculturalist, Rodney Morris, who's another big character in the book. I located his family who returned to the States and was in upstate New York, and they gave me access to the family's personal archives. So I had hundreds of letters from their family and all these pictures and stuff like that. So from there, I kind of just built up this world. Yeah. So, but it's the moment in which I'm very curious and interested in, and the peoples, right? The people where oftentimes they're the folks that are needed to build this new nation state, and yet oftentimes not at the table when the conversations are being had as to what the next steps are and what are the possibilities in terms of real change.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the chat. I'm not seeing any other questions, but if anybody does have one and you want to unmute yourself and share your question, I do want to kind of open it up to that too.
I feel like I'm teaching again. I don't know. Yvonne can, I know, right? Yvonne was my TA a couple of last semester. So yes, it just feels like class all over again.
Yeah, and then there's the how long do you wait to see if people have questions? Well, I'm not hearing or seeing any more, so I wanted to say thank you so much for coming in and doing your talk today.
Thank you, and thank you everyone. Thank you to my family members who are on here, and thank you to my colleagues and friends who decided to take this time. So thank you guys.